We cannot have free and open trade if some countries exploit the system at the expense of others. We support free trade, but it needs to be fair and it needs to be reciprocal, because in the end, unfair trade undermines us all.
From the campaign trail to his inauguration to this very day today, Donald Trump hasn't wavered from his America First agenda. As United States president, he's turned America inward, skeptical of anything and anyone beyond its borders. He literally wants to build a wall. But over the past year, he's also erected figurative walls, cracking down on immigration, leaving the Paris Agreement, slapping steep tariffs on imports. Has this strategy worked for the United States or against it? Joining me now from the Fletcher School at Tufts University is Professor of International Politics and Washington Post contributor Dan Drezner. Welcome back to the show, Dan.
Great to be here, Paul.
Your new piece out this week concludes that President Trump has failed candidate Trump bigly. What do you mean by that?
Well, you have to go back to October of 2016 when Donald Trump as a candidate was talking about how basically the world hated, apparently, Barack Obama. And the example he was giving was of Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte, calling Obama an epithet. And he then complained that other countries were looking more to Russia or China as leaders as opposed to the United States. And so the implicit argument that Trump was making is that this is a bad thing. We don't want other countries looking to Russia and China as opposed to looking to the United States. Well, a year into the Trump presidency, we now have polling data from both Pew and Gallup asking a whole variety of people what they think of U.S. leadership, what they think of other countries' leadership. And essentially, the data show incontrovertibly that since Donald Trump became president, attitudes about American leadership across the rest of the world have soured dramatically. Indeed, American standing in the world in terms of approval ratings is lower than it was in 2008, which, if you think about it, is really impressive because 2008 was the last year of the George W. Bush presidency and the beginning of the subprime mortgage crisis. It was not generally thought to be a high moment for the United States, and nonetheless, we're actually lower now than we were back then. So that's one sign of the degree to which the rest of the world disapproves of the United States. And also when asking about attitudes about other countries' leaders or other countries' leadership, indeed now there's a slightly greater percentage of the world that approves of Chinese leadership as opposed to the United States. And this is not, generally speaking, a good sign for the Trump administration's foreign policy.
On the bright side, though, it's excellent news for George W. Bush, who's now a measurably more popular president relative to his colleagues.
This is true. It is impressive how once you cease to be president, you suddenly are thought to be more popular. And to be fair, I think part of that is a function of the fact that George W. Bush has had a relatively quiet post-presidential career. He was remarkably quiet. He didn't criticize the Obama administration at all, which is the custom of ex-presidents, and seemed genuinely appalled by some of the things that Donald Trump has said in his first year. So it's not surprising that his ratings have gone up.
Now, can you point to anything that the United States has gained through the Trump administration's first year in power where it comes to foreign policy? Are there any wins that he has posted?
I think you can point to a few wins. There's no denying that. You can argue that the Trump administration's strategy against ISIS represents a real success. It's largely a continuation of what the Obama administration did, but nonetheless, the Trump administration hasn't really screwed that up, and ISIS really does seem to be on the run. And there are certain parts of the globe, which even the data show, that look more favorably on the United States under Donald Trump. In Israel, for example, the popularity ratings have gone up. You can argue that various Gulf sheikdoms are far more favorable towards the Trump administration than they were towards the Obama administration, because Obama was far more critical of the domestic politics in these countries. And at least in the polling, there's somewhat greater friendliness among Russians towards the United States, although you can argue the Putin administration feels somewhat disillusioned about that. And I think beyond that, I would say I would give decent marks to the Trump administration's response to the Asia-Pacific Rim. India seems quite pleased with the relationship. So, yeah, there are a few wins. There's no denying that.
Okay. Now, to play devil's advocate, and you bring this up in your piece as well, could Trump have maybe read The Prince by Machiavelli and decided that it's better to be feared than loved? Who cares what a bunch of foreign countries with weird names think about America?
That's absolutely true. And indeed, you can imagine Trump saying that very thing. which Machiavelli very famously said is better to be feared than to be loved. But if you read just a little bit further down the page of The Prince, Machiavelli also makes it very clear that the thing you really want to avoid is being hated. Because if you're hated, then people lose their fear of you, they lose their respect of you. And if there's one thing that seems relatively obvious based on the first year of polling data, a lot of people across the world hate Donald Trump. And unfortunately, by extension, now probably feel more animus towards the United States more generally.
I have to figure that this would make it harder to be a member of the diplomatic corps, the American diplomatic corps, than it used to be.
It is, and we're already seeing that in the form of the U.S. ambassador to Panama resigning because he felt that he could no longer defend what the Trump administration was saying. And that was even before President Trump described various countries in words that I'm not sure I can use on your program. And you're seeing other diplomats being called in asking to explain or justify various things Donald Trump has said or tweeted. Yes, it's extremely difficult to be in the diplomatic corps, which is probably one of the reasons why applications to join the Foreign Service last year took a major nosedive.
I would also have to imagine that of all the various things that might affect the president's domestic popularity, the perceptions of the United States internationally would not be top of the list. Foreign policy and foreign perceptions very rarely drive domestic electoral considerations.
That's true, but it is worth noting that back in 2008, the number one, traditionally when you ask Americans, what's the number one foreign policy concern you have, they have almost always answered protecting American jobs, which is not terribly surprising. The exception actually was in 2008, when Americans were asked about it during that election. What they actually said then was the decline in American standing overseas. So it will be interesting to see whether in the midterms or in 2020, if the economy continues to perform well, whether concerns about the loss of U.S. standing or the loss of U.S. face matters, because, you know, you can take a look at the rest of the world, and it seems that in some ways the rest of the world is sort of bypassing the United States. I'm talking to you in Canada. Canada has signed a free trade agreement with the European Union. The TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, has also come to a completion. And the very fact that Donald Trump at Davos suggested that maybe the U.S. would consider joining it, he was not probably being very serious, but even the fact that he suggested that hints that I think the Trump administration is somewhat surprised by the fact that countries are not thronging to join, you know, bilateral trade agreements with the United States, which is not terribly surprising if you knew anything about trade policy.
Okay. We'll leave it there. Thank you very much for joining us again, Dan Drezner.
Thank you very much.